In the most unlikely places, murder finds its opportunity. Tonight's mystery, murder in the Perfumed Catacombs, proves this truth once again. This is The Little Grey Cells, and I am Arthur Hastings, chronicler of the brilliant Hercule Poirot's most baffling cases. If you're new to our little gathering, please subscribe and leave us a comment revealing your corner of the world. Where beauty's essence concealed a daughter's poisoned truth. Now, prepare your tea, silence the outside world, and awaken those little grey cells. A puzzle awaits, and with Poirot's guidance, we shall solve it together. Chapter 1. The Calm That Lies. "You see, mon ami," said Hercule Poirot, lifting his glass of Provençal rosé to catch the afternoon light. "The nose does not lie. Never does it lie." Lucien Narcisse smiled indulgently across the small iron table. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the particular elegance of bearing that comes from a lifetime spent in the pursuit of beauty. His hands, resting beside his own glass, were long-fingered and immaculate, the hands of a pianist or a surgeon or a man who had devoted 40 years to the precise architecture of scent. "You are certain, then," Narcisse said, his English excellent but carrying that particular French formality that never quite departed, even in jest, "that you could distinguish the true bergamot from the synthetic? Blindfolded, perhaps?" Blindfolded, in darkness, in a room of 1,000 competing fragrances. Poirot's eyes gleamed with a pleasure that was not entirely free from vanity. "It is a question of the little grey cells, naturally, but also of the discipline of the senses. The true bergamot, it has a complexity, how do you say, a life that the laboratory cannot capture. Not yet. Perhaps not ever." They sat outside the Café de la Fontaine in the heart of Grasse, that ancient town which clings to the hillside above the French Riviera like a beautiful, aromatic limpet. It was April, and the jasmine season had begun. The air itself seemed textured with fragrance, not the simple sweetness that a novice might expect, but something richer, more mysterious, as though the very stones of the narrow streets exhaled perfume accumulated over centuries. The square before them bustled with the peculiar mixture of local life and tourism that characterized Grasse in spring. English women in sensible shoes examined bottles in shop windows. A group of Americans, loud and enthusiastic, emerged from the Musée International de la Parfumerie. At the fountain, a baroque confection of limestone nymphs and dolphins, 2 children sailed paper boats, while their grandmother watched with the infinite patience of the very old or the very bored. Poirot adjusted the placement of his wineglass so that it sat in precise alignment with the edge of his napkin. The small gesture gave him satisfaction. Order. Always order. It was the foundation upon which reason built her palace. "You are comfortable at the villa?" Narcisse inquired. "Sylvie has ensured that everything is to your liking?" "Mademoiselle, your daughter has been most gracious." Poirot inclined his head. "Though, I confess, I see little of her. She is occupied, I think, with her work?" "Always." A shadow passed across Narcisse's face, too quickly to properly identify. But Poirot, who catalogued such things as a lepidopterist might pin butterflies, noted it and stored it away. Pride? Concern? Something more complex than either? She has her mother's brilliance, but, how to say this, not her warmth. Sylvie lives in the mind, in the laboratory. She sees perfume as chemistry, as puzzle to be solved. I see it as He gestured helplessly at the air around them. As life itself. Each generation must find its own path, Poirot observed. It is the way of the world. Perhaps. Narcisse did not sound convinced. He reached for his glass, then stopped, his fingers hovering above the stem. A curious hesitation, Poirot thought, as though the mention of his daughter's name had introduced something unwelcome into the conversation, a discordant note in what should have been a pleasant afternoon melody. A waiter materialized to refill their glasses, moving with that particular efficiency of waiters in provincial France, neither servile nor familiar, but occupying some dignified middle territory that was entirely their own invention. As he departed, Poirot caught a fragment of conversation from the neighbouring table. Two elderly Frenchmen arguing with great passion about whether the morning's boule match had been fairly adjudicated. The normalcy of it pleased him. He had come to Grasse at Narcisse's invitation for precisely this: respite, beauty, the pleasure of old friendship. There had been too many deaths recently, too many drawing rooms concealing hatred behind good manners, too many revelations that stripped away the comfortable surfaces of English life to expose the rot beneath. Here, surely, in this town devoted to beauty, to the capture and preservation of fleeting fragrance, there could be nothing but peace. It was at precisely this moment, as he later reflected with some irony, that peace ended. Monsieur Poirot? The voice was low, urgent, and unmistakably distressed. Poirot looked up. A woman stood beside their table. She was perhaps 40, dressed in a grey suit that had seen better days, her dark hair imperfectly pinned beneath a hat that had once been fashionable. Her face, narrow, intelligent, marked by some recent strain, was not familiar to him, but her eyes arrested his attention. They were dark, almost black, and they held a quality he had seen many times before. The particular desperation of someone who has exhausted every avenue except one. Madame? Poirot rose at once, his continental manners automatic. You have the advantage of me, I think. They say you see everything. Her French was native, but bore traces of another accent beneath it, something Poirot could not immediately place, though the little grey cells filed it for later examination. Arabic, perhaps, or Berber. They say that nothing escapes Monsieur Poirot. Then see this. She thrust out her hand. In it lay a woman's glove, white kid leather, expensive, of the sort worn for formal occasions. But the fingertips were stained a dark red-brown. Not dye, Poirot knew at once. Blood. Madame, you must explain, he began, but she was already turning away. The catacombs, she said over her shoulder. Before it is too late. Wait! Narcisse called out, rising as well, but the woman was moving with surprising speed, weaving between tables and disappearing into the crowded market arcade that opened onto the square. Poirot looked down at the glove in his hand. The leather was fine, recently cleaned except for those telltale stains. Inside, embroidered in silk thread, were initials. I.C. You know this woman? He asked Narcisse quietly. No. The perfumer's face had gone pale. But the glove. Imogen wears such gloves. I have seen them. Imogen? Imogen Carver, an Englishwoman, a client. She commissioned a signature scent, something unique, something that would be hers alone. She has been working with Sylvie for the past month. Narcisse gripped the back of his chair.
Hercule, those initials.
I see, Poirot said softly.
Quite so.
He looked again at the stained fingertips, and then at the crowd milling about the square. Tourists and locals, buyers and sellers, all of them moving in their separate orbits, all of them innocent of whatever knowledge had driven a desperate woman to approach a detective she did not know in a town devoted to beauty, with blood on a white glove. The church bell struck 4. The sound echoed off the ancient stones, and somewhere in the labyrinth of streets behind them, a door slammed shut. "The catacombs," she said. Poirot folded the glove with care and placed it in his jacket pocket. "Tell me, mon ami, what exactly are these catacombs?" Narcisse's expression was grim.
"The old limestone quarries beneath the town. They run for kilometers. Storage vaults now for the aging of certain essences. Dark, cold, easy to become lost in if one does not know the way."
"And who has access to them?"
"Those of us in the trade. Workers, a few scholars." He paused.
"And the clients who wish to see where their perfumes will be born?"
"Then,"
said Hercule Poirot, settling his hat upon his head with precision,
"I think we must go below, you and I. Immediately."
The cafe, the sunshine, the peaceful square, all of it receded behind them as they walked. Ahead lay only narrow streets descending into shadow, and beneath those, older shadows still. The jasmine scent grew stronger as they walked, until it seemed less like perfume than like a promise. Or perhaps a warning. Chapter 2. Descent into Questions. The entrance to the catacombs lay behind the Maison Narcisse itself, accessed through a courtyard that few tourists ever glimpsed. Poirot followed his friend past the elegant shopfront, all brass and beveled glass, with bottles arranged in the window like jewels in a crown, and through a side door that led to the working heart of the perfume house. Here, the romance gave way to function. Steel tables, glass beakers, copper stills that gleamed under electric light. A young man in a leather apron looked up from his work, eyebrows rising in question, but Narcisse waved him back to his task.
"The laboratory is on this floor,"
Narcisse explained, his voice lower now, as though the building itself demanded quieter tones.
"The blending rooms above. And below."
He gestured toward a heavy door set into the far wall.
"Below, we keep what must be kept cool and dark."
The door opened onto stone steps, worn concave by generations of feet. Electric bulbs had been strung at intervals along the descending passage, but their light seemed grudging, as though the darkness resented the intrusion and pressed back against it. Poirot descended carefully. The air grew noticeably cooler with each step, and the scents changed, the bright florals of the laboratory giving way to something deeper, earthier, stone and moisture and time.
"These quarries date to Roman times,"
Narcisse said from behind him.
"Perhaps earlier. The limestone was prized for building. You see it in all the old houses of class. When the perfume trade began to flourish, the abandoned tunnels proved ideal for storage. Certain essences improve with age, like wine. The temperature here remains constant year-round."
They reached the bottom of the stairs. Before them stretched a tunnel, perhaps 8 feet high and equally wide, carved directly from the living rock. More electric bulbs traced a path into the distance, but side passages branched off into darkness at irregular intervals.
It is extensive? Poirot inquired. Very. A maze, truly. There are maps, naturally, but... Narcisse shrugged in that particularly Gallic way that conveyed volumes. One learns by walking, not by studying paper. The walls were lined with wooden racks, and upon these racks sat hundreds of dark glass bottles, each labelled in careful script. Poirot paused to examine one. Jasmine Absolute, dated 1932. 5 years of aging in perfect darkness. And Mademoiselle Carver has been down here? Twice, that I know of. Sylvie brought her to select certain bass notes for her commission. Narcisse's face was troubled. Hercule, you do not truly think... I think nothing yet, Poirot interrupted gently. I observe only, and I ask questions.
When did you last see Mademoiselle Carver?
Yesterday afternoon. She came for her daily consultation with Sylvie. They work together each day, refining the formula. Imogen has very particular ideas about what she wishes her perfume to convey. He paused. She is not an easy woman, I think. Precise, demanding, but there is passion beneath the coldness. An heiress, you said? The Carver shipping line. Her father died 2 years ago, left her everything. She came to France to escape the weight of it, she told me, to find something beautiful that belonged to her alone. There was genuine sympathy in Narcisse's voice. Wealth does not always bring happiness, n'est-ce pas? Very rarely, Poirot agreed. And the woman who approached us, you have never seen her before? Never. They walked deeper into the catacombs, their footsteps echoing strangely off the stone. The air was still and cold, and Poirot found himself breathing shallowly, as though something in the atmosphere discouraged deep inhalation. The electric lights created pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow, and in those shadows, anything might wait. Someone must maintain these lights, Poirot observed. Who has that responsibility? Rashid. He is our distiller, Algerian, knows the old methods. He lives in quarters above the workshop, manages the storage rotation, keeps the equipment functioning. Narcisse gestured vaguely upward. A quiet man, serious about his work. He arrived last autumn, came with excellent references from a house in Antibes. I should like to speak with him. Naturellement. They had progressed, perhaps 100 meters into the tunnels, when Poirot stopped abruptly. His head tilted, a gesture his friends knew well. The moment when something caught the attention of those little grey cells. You have seen something? Narcisse asked. The dust, Poirot said softly. Upon the floor here, it has been disturbed. Recently, I think. It was true. The limestone dust that covered the tunnel floor in a fine, pale layer showed footprints. Several sets, moving in different directions. Most were the marks of working boots, but one set was notably different. Smaller, narrower. The print of an elegant woman's shoe. Poirot knelt with some difficulty. He was not a young man, and his knees reminded him of this fact with dismaying regularity, and examined the prints more closely. These lead down the left-hand passage, he said, pointing to where the footprints diverged from the main tunnel. Into darkness. That section has no lights, Narcisse warned. It is not in regular use. We store only the oldest stock there, items requiring no immediate access. Then we shall require torches, I think. Narcisse produced 2 electric torches from a cabinet mounted on the wall, clearly provided for precisely such occasions.
The beams were strong and bright, cutting through the darkness like knives. The side passage was narrower than the main tunnel, and the ceiling lower. Poirot felt the weight of stone above him, the crushing mass of the town itself pressing down. It was not a sensation he enjoyed.
Give him a railway carriage, a comfortable study, a sunlit terrace. These were the proper venues for a civilized man. This descent into the earth, into cold and darkness, offended something fundamental in his nature. But the footprints led onward, and so must he. The passage twisted twice, then opened suddenly into a chamber perhaps 20 feet across. Here the quarrying had been more extensive, creating a space like a rough amphitheatre. Wooden racks lined the walls, stacked with bottles whose labels had faded to illegibility. And in the centre of the chamber, sitting upright upon a wooden chair, was a woman. Narcisse's torch beam found her first. He made a sound, not quite a cry, more a sudden exhalation of shock. Poirot moved forward carefully, his own torch steady. The woman wore a dove-grey dress of excellent cut
and white kid gloves, or rather, one white glove. The other hand was bare, and in its palm rested a small glass vial, perhaps 3 inches tall. Her face was turned upward, as though she had been examining the ceiling when death found her. But it was not the ceiling that held Poirot's attention. It was the strange, terrible artistry of what had been done to her. Around her lips, painted with precise care, was a circle of deep red. Not lipstick, but something else. Something that caught the torchlight and gleamed with an oily sheen. Her closed eyelids bore the same substance, and a single stroke had been drawn down her throat like a crimson ribbon. The smell in the chamber was overwhelming. Roses and something sharper, something that made the back of Poirot's throat constrict.
Mon Dieu,
Narcisse whispered. Imogen. Poirot approached the body with the careful respect of long experience. He did not touch, not yet. He observed. The woman was perhaps 35, with fair hair arranged in a simple style. Her features, even in death, suggested intelligence and will. The grey dress was unwrinkled, her posture almost relaxed. She might have been resting, were it not for the stillness that no sleep could counterfeit, and the terrible decoration that had been applied to her face. "The red substance," Poirot said quietly. "This is perfume oil, is it not?" "Yes." Narcisse's voice was hoarse. "Different types. Around the mouth, rose absolute, I think. On the eyes, perhaps tuberose. And the throat." He leaned closer, though the effort clearly cost him. "Clove, or carnation. Something with eugenol. And these would be dangerous?" "In such concentration, in an enclosed space," Narcisse gestured helplessly. "The fumes alone might overwhelm someone. And if ingested..." He stopped, unable to continue. Poirot turned his attention to the vial in the dead woman's palm. It was sealed with wax, and inside, visible even by torchlight, were layers of different coloured liquids, oil and essence, separated by density into distinct strata. 7 layers, he counted. 7 precise bands of colour, ranging from deep amber to pale gold. Attached to the vial by silk thread was a small card. Upon it, in beautiful calligraphy, were written 3 words. Note 1/7. "What does this mean?" Narcisse breathed. But Poirot did not answer. His eyes had gone very still, very focused. He was looking past the body now, to the wall behind it, where someone had used a piece of limestone chalk to draw a simple symbol. A flower with 7 petals, each one numbered. The jasmine of Grasse had 7 petals in its traditional representation. Every perfumer in the town would know this. Every tourist guidebook mentioned it.
"We must fetch the police,"
Narcisse said.
"Immediately."
Yes, Poirot agreed. But he did not move. He stood in that cold chamber beneath tons of stone, breathing air thick with roses and death, and felt the familiar weight settle upon him. The weight of responsibility, of knowledge that would come too late for this woman, but perhaps not too late for others. For the message was clear enough to anyone with eyes to see. This was not an end. It was a beginning. Note 1/7. Chapter 3. The game announces itself. Inspector Lebrun of the Grasse police was a small, neat man with a moustache that aspired to magnificence but achieved only adequacy, a fact that appeared to pain him whenever he encountered Poirot's own superior example. He stood now in the chamber of death, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the scene with the methodical attention of a man who had investigated precisely 3 murders in a 20-year career, none of them remotely like this.
"It is grotesque," he pronounced at last. "Grotesque and theatrical. A crime of passion, surely. Some rejected lover, some madman with an obsession."
"Perhaps," Poirot said non-committally. 3 hours had passed since the discovery. The body remained where they had found it. Lebrun had been adamant on this point until the police photographer could arrive from Nice. Powerful lamps had been brought down, transforming the chamber from a place of shadows into something harshly illuminated, almost surgical in its brightness. The effect was to make the artistry of the murder even more apparent. A doctor had made his examination and departed, looking shaken. Asphyxiation, he had pronounced, though whether from the fumes of the perfume oils or from some other cause, he could not immediately determine. The body would need to be removed for proper autopsy. "The time of death?" Poirot had inquired. "Between 12 and 24 hours ago. The cool temperature makes precision difficult." So, yesterday, then. While Poirot had sat in the sunshine, drinking wine and congratulating himself on his palate, Imogen Carver had been dying in darkness beneath his feet. The thought did not improve his mood.
"The vial is the key."
"Naturellement," Lebrun said now, warming to his subject. He had claimed the small glass bottle as evidence, though he had allowed Poirot to examine it first. A message from the killer. Perhaps a rival perfumer? Professional jealousy can run very deep in Grasse, Monsieur Poirot. Fortunes are made and lost on the success of a single scent.
"Then you believe Mademoiselle Carver was killed because of the perfume she was commissioning?"
What else? She was wealthy, yes, but she came to Grasse specifically for this purpose. She had no enemies here, no entanglements. The motive must lie in her purpose. Lebrun nodded, pleased with his reasoning. And this note 1/7. Clearly it refers to the 7 notes of a perfume. Top, heart, and base, with gradations between. Every perfumer knows this. "Actually," said a cool voice from the tunnel entrance, "a perfume can have far more than 7 notes, or far fewer. The number is not fixed." They turned. A young woman stood in the archway, her silhouette stark against the lights behind her. She stepped forward,
and Poirot recognized Sylvie Narcisse. She was perhaps 28, with her father's elegant bone structure, but none of his warmth. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a white laboratory coat over a plain black dress. Behind wire-rimmed spectacles, her eyes were remarkable, intelligent, analytical, and utterly contained. "Mademoiselle," Lebrun said, his tone softening automatically in the presence of youth and femininity. "This is not a place for—" "I worked with her." Sylvie's voice cut through his platitude like a scalpel. "I have a right to see." She moved past the inspector without waiting for permission and stood looking down at the body. Her face registered no emotion whatever, no grief, no shock, no horror. She might have been examining a failed experiment. And yet, Poirot watched with the attention he gave all such moments. Her left hand, hidden at her side and invisible to the others, gripped the fabric of her laboratory coat so tightly that the knuckles went white. "The oils are interesting," she observed after a moment. "Rose, tuberose, and clove. Yes, but not just any rose. That's Bulgarian rose absolute, extremely concentrated. The tuberose is Indian, I think, and the clove has been mixed with something else. Myrrh, perhaps?" She tilted her head slightly. "A very specific selection, not random at all." "You can tell all this by looking?" Lebrun asked, doubt evident in his voice. "I can tell by smelling. Even diluted by time and air, the signature is clear." She turned to Poirot. "You are the detective my father speaks of, the famous Hercule Poirot." "I am he, mademoiselle." "Then you will want to know what Imogen said to me yesterday afternoon, during our last consultation." Sylvie's tone remained perfectly level. "She told me she felt she was being watched, that someone had been in her hotel room, though nothing was taken, that she had received a note, unsigned, telling her to leave Grasse while she still could." "And you did not think to mention this before?" Lebrun demanded. "You did not ask before?" Sylvie's gaze remained on Poirot. "Besides, wealthy women often imagine persecution. It establishes their importance." "I did not take it seriously." "Do you take it seriously now?" Poirot asked quietly. For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, precisely, but something that looked almost like grief held at arm's length, acknowledged but not permitted to approach. "I think," she said slowly, "that someone has made a very elaborate statement, and I think that vial is not just a message, it is a formula." She moved to the wooden table where Lebrun had placed the vial and bent to examine it without touching. 7 distinct layers, each one a different essential oil, separated by density and miscibility. If one were to analyze the proportions, the specific materials, she straightened, it would tell a story, perhaps even a name. "A name?" Lebrun frowned. "You mean the killer's name, encoded in perfume? That is absurd." "Is it?" Sylvie's smile was wintry. "Perfumers have used coded formulae for centuries to protect trade secrets. A sufficiently skilled chemist could hide anything in such a message. A date, a location, a person. The question is whether the code is meant to be broken or merely to taunt." Poirot studied the young woman with interest. Brilliance without warmth, her father had said. He had not exaggerated. Yet there was something else here, something beneath the cold surface. A tension, as of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Anger, yes. But anger directed where? At the killer? At the victim? At some third party, invisible to all but herself?
I will need to question you formally, mademoiselle, Lebrun was saying. You and all members of your father's household. This woman was your client.
She died in your family's catacombs. She was not in our section. Sylvie's interruption was flat. This chamber is part of the old Beaumont storage area. It has not been used by Maison Narcisse for 15 years. Beaumont? Poirot's attention sharpened. This is the rival house your father mentioned? Hardly rivals anymore. The widow Beaumont operates on a far smaller scale than she once did. But yes, technically, this is her storage space, though she rarely visits it. Sylvie paused, and in that pause, Poirot detected a careful selection of words, the particular hesitation of someone deciding how much truth to dispense. Her son died in a distillation accident 5 years ago. She has not been the same since. And she would have keys to access this area? Yes, as would we. As would Rashid, our distiller, as would any of a dozen workers who have been employed in the perfume trade here over the years. Sylvie gestured at the tunnel. These catacombs are not a fortress, Monsieur Poirot. They are a place of business. People come and go. Only the most valuable stocks are kept locked. Inspector Lebrun was making notes, his expression increasingly harried. I will need a complete list of everyone with access, and I want the vial sent to Nice for analysis. If it contains some kind of code, as Mademoiselle suggests. It will take weeks, Sylvie said dismissively. Gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, these things cannot be rushed. Then we must do our best with the time we have, Poirot said. He had been silent for some minutes, his egg-shaped head tilted in that attitude of concentration his friends knew well. Tell me, Mademoiselle Sylvie, this Festival of Jasmine that approaches, it is important, yes? It is the most important event of the year for Grasse. 5 days from now, thousands of visitors, buyers from all the great fashion houses, journalists. Her eyes narrowed. Why? Because, Poirot said softly, if this is note 1 of 7, then we must ask ourselves, where and when will the others appear? And what will happen when all 7 notes are complete? The silence that followed was profound. Even Lebois seemed to grasp the implications. You think there will be more murders? The inspector said finally. I think, Poirot replied, that we are meant to believe there will be more murders. Whether this belief corresponds to reality remains to be seen. But the killer has gone to considerable trouble to create a narrative. 7 notes. 7 days, perhaps. A festival approaching. This is not conclusion, Inspector. This is announcement. He looked again at the body of Imogen Carver, at her painted face and folded hands, at the vial that had been placed in her palm like a macabre gift. The game, Hercule Poirot said, has been declared. Now, we must discover the rules. And in the cold electric light of the catacombs, with death still seated patiently in its chair, the hunt began. Chapter 4. The Distiller's Grief. The distillery occupied the ground floor of a stone building that leaned against the hillside as though weary from centuries of standing. Poirot reached it shortly after dawn, having slept poorly in a bed that was comfortable but haunted by questions. Inspector Lebrun had protested the early hour of inquiry, but Poirot had been firm. The little grey cells, they do not keep to a schedule, mon ami.
And I have found that people are often most honest when roused before they have constructed the day's defences. The door stood ajar. From within came the sound of water running and the clink of glass against metal. Poirot entered without knocking. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, the ceiling lost in shadows despite the morning light slanting through high windows. Copper stills of various sizes dominated the room, their swan-necked pipes catching the sun like church bells. The air was thick with competing scents, lavender, rosemary, something citrus that made Poirot's eyes water slightly. A man stood at a long wooden table, his back to the door, rinsing glass vessels with methodical care. He was tall, perhaps 40, with the broad shoulders of someone accustomed to physical labour. His skin was the deep brown of North Africa, and his dark hair was going grey at the temples. "Monsieur Rachid?" Poirot inquired. The man turned slowly, unsurprised by the interruption. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and deep-set eyes that had seen more than they wished to remember. "You are the detective." It was not a question. His French carried an accent that spoke of Arabic as the mother tongue. "Monsieur Narcisse said you would come." "I am Hercule Poirot, and yes, I have questions, if you will permit them." "I permit nothing and forbid nothing. I am a worker here, not the master." But Rachid gestured to a pair of stools near the window, an invitation of sorts. They sat. Poirot arranged himself with care, his patent leather shoes placed just so, his hands folded upon the head of his walking stick. Rachid simply waited, his expression revealing nothing. "You maintain the catacombs," Poirot began. "The electrical system, the storage racks, the inventory rotation." "Yes. So you would know if someone had been in the tunnels who should not have been there. I would know if they left traces. Not all visitors leave traces." Rachid's gaze was steady. "The English lady left traces. She wore perfume. Something with vanilla and amber, not subtle. I could smell where she had been hours after she passed." "You were aware of her visits then?" "I was aware of everything that happened below." A pause. "Until yesterday, when I was not there." "And where were you yesterday, monsieur?" "In Antibes, collecting equipment from a supplier, new tubing for the stills, copper that does not corrode as quickly as the old. I left at 8 in the morning, returned at 6 in the evening." Rachid's hands remained perfectly still in his lap. "When I returned, the police were here. Monsieur Narcisse told me what had been found." "You had met Mademoiselle Carver?" "3 times. Twice when Mademoiselle Sylvie brought her to select essences from storage. Once when she came alone, looking for me." Rachid stood abruptly and moved to the nearest still. He adjusted a valve with precise care, though Poirot suspected the valve had needed no adjustment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that the careful stillness of his body could not entirely conceal. "She wished to ask me questions." "What manner of questions?" "She asked if I was Algerian. I said yes. She asked if I had family in Sidi Madani." He stopped, one hand gripping the copper pipe. "I said I had once." The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of 2 men at ease. It was the held breath before a confession. "Then she asked if I knew what had happened there in 1924. "And you replied?" Rachid turned, and now his face showed what he had been holding back. A deep, controlled fury that had been banked like coals for years. "I told her that my sister had died in Sidi Madani.
She was 14 years old, working in a distillery that processed orange blossom for export to France. The equipment was old, poorly maintained. When it exploded, 5 workers died, my sister among them.
His hands gripped the edge of the table.
The French company paid blood money to the families and closed the matter.
No one was held responsible.
This must have been painful to speak of.
Pain is not the word.
He released the table, flexing his fingers as though surprised by their own strength.
But she knew already. She had researched it. She told me her father's shipping company had transported the equipment to Algeria, that she had found the records, the correspondence, the complaints about the machinery that had been ignored. His voice cracked slightly. She told me she was sorry.
And what did you say?
I said that sorrow changes nothing, that the dead remain dead, and the guilty remain free.
Rashid's shoulders sagged, and for a moment the fury left him, replaced by something more terrible: exhaustion.
But she would not accept this. She said she was establishing a fund, that the families of those who died would receive proper compensation, that she could not undo her father's sins, but she would not profit from them either. The morning light shifted, and a shaft of sun caught the copper stills, setting them ablaze. In that sudden brightness, Rashid looked older than his years, a man carrying more than any back should bear.
"You believed her?" Poirot asked. "I did not want to believe her. I came to Grasse to—" He stopped, and in that truncated sentence, Poirot heard everything. The original intention, the plan for vengeance that had slowly been eroded by proximity to its target's humanity. It does not matter now what I came for. She was not her father. This much became clear. And now she is dead, and her fund will die with her. And nothing changes after all.
"You have motive, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "The death of your sister, the injury to your family. A man might kill for such reasons, but I am not that man. Not anymore." Rashid met his gaze directly. "I do not kill women who apologize, even if the apology comes too late. The inspector will verify your alibi." "Let him verify. I have receipts, witnesses, a train ticket." Rashid moved to a cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages marked with chemical formulae and dates. "But I can tell you something more useful than my innocence, Monsieur Poirot." He opened the journal to a page marked with ribbon. "I keep records of who enters the catacombs. Not officially, my own practice. I like to know who walks beneath my feet." His finger traced an entry. 4 days ago, I saw Madame Beaumont in the tunnels, in a section that is not hers. Speaking with someone I could not see clearly, I heard raised voices. A woman's voice saying, "You have no right to that name." And the other voice? The acoustics distort everything. But the next day, I found this. From his pocket, he produced a small square of paper, folded once. Poirot took it with careful fingers and opened it. The paper was expensive, cream-coloured, watermarked. Upon it, in beautiful calligraphy, were written 5 words. "The past is not buried." "Where did you find this?" "In the chamber where the body was discovered, 3 days before the murder. Lying on the chair, the same chair where they posed her." Rashid's face was grim. "I showed it to Mademoiselle Sylvie yesterday morning, before I left for Antibes. I asked if she knew the handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. He paused, and Poirot saw something shift in his expression. The careful observation of a man who has learned to read faces because his survival has depended on it. She said she did not recognize it, but she lied. I have learned to recognize when people lie to me. Poirot folded the note and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. I must keep this. Keep it. Show it to the inspector. Show it to the devil himself if it will help catch whoever killed that woman. Rashid's voice was bitter. She was trying to do the right thing, Monsieur Poirot, and someone murdered her for it. Or, Poirot said softly, rising from his stool and settling his hat upon his head, someone murdered her for an entirely different reason, and allowed us all to assume it was about amends and the past. He met Rashid's eyes. In my experience, monsieur, the obvious motive is rarely the true one. It is simply the one we are meant to see. Outside, the sun had risen fully over Grasse, and the town was waking to another day of beauty and commerce. But Poirot stood in the narrow street, turning the note over in his fingers, and thought about buried pasts and careful hands, and 7 notes not yet complete. Somewhere in this town of perfume and shadows, a killer was preparing the next movement in their carefully orchestrated composition. And Hercule Poirot, for all his little grey cells, was not yet certain of the melody. Chapter 5. The Widow's House. The widow Beaumont lived on the Rue des Martyrs, in a house that had once been grand. Poirot approached it through streets still slick with morning dew, past shuttered windows and flower boxes that overflowed with geraniums. The address had been supplied by Narcisse with evident reluctance. There was history there, Poirot sensed, the complicated history of competitors who had once been colleagues, perhaps even friends. The house itself was narrow and tall, its pale stone facade marked by decades of sun and rain. The brass nameplate beside the door had been polished recently, but the door itself needed paint. A study in genteel decline. Pride maintained in small things, while larger things crumbled. He lifted the knocker, a brass hand holding a bouquet of roses, and let it fall twice. The woman who answered was perhaps 60, dressed in black that was too formal for morning and too plain for morning. Her face had been beautiful once and remained handsome, with the kind of bone structure that age refines rather than destroys. Her grey hair was arranged in an old-fashioned style, and she wore no jewellery except a cameo brooch at her throat. Madame Beaumont? I am Hercule Poirot. Her eyes, pale blue, very sharp, took his measure in an instant. The detective? Yes, I thought you would come eventually. The police were here last evening, asking their tedious questions. I suppose you will ask more interesting ones. I shall endeavour to, madame. She stepped aside. You may as well come in. I have just made coffee, and I dislike drinking alone. It is a widow's particular curse. Everything becomes solitary. The interior matched the exterior, faded grandeur scrupulously maintained. The parlour was furnished in the style of 30 years prior, all dark wood and velvet upholstery, with photographs in silver frames arranged on every surface. Poirot's eye caught one immediately. A young man in military uniform, his smile confident, his resemblance to Madame Beaumont unmistakable. My son, Philippe, she had followed his gaze. He died 5 years ago. An accident in the laboratory. Sometimes I think I should have closed the house entirely after that. But this was Philippe's inheritance. I could not bear to abandon it. My condolences, madame. No. She poured coffee from a silver pot, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. It merely becomes familiar. One learns to carry it, as one learns to carry any weight. Milk? Sugar? Black, I thank you. She did not wait for him to begin. You wish to know about the English girl? I met her twice. Once at a reception Lucien hosted, once when she came to my workshop, asking questions about vintage techniques. Her expression was difficult to read. She was an odd creature, terribly earnest. She wanted to understand everything, not just the result, but the process, the history. What sort of history? The old methods, how we worked before synthesizers, when everything came from flowers and roots and the careful distillation of living things. She said her perfume must be honest. The widow's smile was wry, as though perfume could be dishonest. It is always an illusion, Monsieur Poirot. We make you smell roses in December. We conjure gardens that never existed. Honesty has nothing to do with it. Poirot set down his cup. You were in the catacombs 4 days ago. You spoke with someone there. A heated conversation. She did not flinch. I go weekly to check my remaining stock. I have perhaps 100 bottles left. Essences I cannot bear to sell and cannot bear to dispose of. Some date back to my husband's time. And the person with whom you argued? Now her composure cracked slightly. Rashid told you, I suppose. That man sees everything. She rose and moved to the window. Very well. It was Sylvie Narcisse. She was in my section of the catacombs, not near her father's storage, examining bottles that have nothing to do with Maison Narcisse. She had a notebook. She was copying formulas from my labels. For what purpose? She claimed curiosity, research for some monograph. The widow turned, her face now openly bitter. But I can guess the truth. Innovation requires foundation, Monsieur Poirot. What better way to acquire it than to steal it from a competitor too weak to fight back? That family has taken enough from me. You told her she had no right to that name. What name, madame? The widow's face went very still. It is nothing, a private matter. I think you will find that I am an excellent judge of what is related and what is not. She returned to her chair, suddenly looking her age. Very well. Sylvie was copying the formula for a scent called Algérie, created by my husband in 1923, commissioned by a French colonial who wished to give his wife something that captured the essence of their orange groves in Sidi Madani. Never commercially produced, the patron paid handsomely for exclusivity. The name struck Poirot like a bell. Sidi Madani, where Rashid's sister had died, where Imogen Carver's father's equipment had failed. This patron, he said carefully, do you recall his name? Of course. One does not forget one's most generous clients. She met his eyes. His name was Carver. The silence was profound. Madame, where were you yesterday between noon and 6? Here, alone. I have no alibi. I am old and I live alone, and I spend my days with memories. Her voice was steady. But I did not kill that girl. I pitied her. She carried her father's sins as though they were her own. Poirot rose. At the door, he paused. One final question. Do you recognize this handwriting? He showed her the note. The past is not buried. She studied it, and something flickered in her pale eyes. A flash of recognition, quickly smothered.
"No," she said. "I do not know that hand."
She closed the door firmly, and Poirot stood in the narrow street. Two people now who had denied recognizing the calligraphy. Two people who, he was increasingly certain, had lied. "The past is not buried," the note had said, but someone was determined to excavate it. Chapter 6. The Laboratory of Lies. Rather than climbing the stairs to Sylvie's laboratory, Poirot made a detour. It was a small act of investigative discipline, the kind that looked like nothing from the outside, but could change the shape of an entire case. He went to the public library of Grasse, a modest building that smelled of dust and old paper, and spent 40 minutes examining the archives of the local newspaper from 1924. The explosion at Sidi Madani had merited a paragraph. A single paragraph, buried on the third page, between a report on olive yields and an advertisement for dental powder. 5 dead, equipment failure, an investigation pending. There was no follow-up article. The investigation, if it had occurred, had been as thoroughly buried as the victims themselves. But one detail caught his eye. Among the names of the dead, listed without ceremony as though they were inventory rather than people, was the name Fatima Nasiri, 14 years old. And beside it, the name of the distillery foreman who had been killed, Hassan Nasiri, her father. Rashid had said his sister died. He had not mentioned that his father died too. 2 losses, not one. A family destroyed, not merely bereaved. Poirot left the library, with this knowledge settling into the architecture of his understanding like a keystone. Then he climbed the stairs to the laboratory. He found Sylvie bent over a workbench, her attention fixed on a glass apparatus of bewildering complexity. Tubes spiraled into flasks, which fed into condensers, which dripped precious liquid, drop by drop, into a waiting vial. The room smelled of 1,000 things simultaneously, a chaos that somehow organized itself into coherence. She did not look up. "Monsieur Poirot, I wondered when you would come. Close the door, please. Drafts disturb the distillation." He obeyed, then moved closer. Her hands were absolutely steady. No tremor, no hesitation. The hands of someone who trusted herself completely. "You are creating a perfume?" he inquired. "Attempting to recreate one?" She made an adjustment to the flame beneath one of the flasks. "A client once commissioned a scent that contained a note of black tea. Not the tea itself, which is simple enough to capture, but the memory of tea, the particular scent that rises from a porcelain cup on a winter morning, with bergamot and honey and something ineffable that is not the tea at all, but rather one's emotion while drinking it." She straightened, finally meeting his gaze. "It is proving difficult." "Tell me about Mademoiselle Carver. Not the client, but the woman." Sylvie considered this with the seriousness she brought to chemical equations. "She was precise, demanding. She knew what she wanted, which is rarer than you might imagine. Most clients say they desire uniqueness, but actually want to smell like everyone else, only slightly better. Imogen wanted to smell like herself, whoever that was." "And how did she define that?" "She said she wanted to smell like redemption." A pause. "I asked what redemption smelled like. She said, clean, but with a memory of dirt. Light,
but with knowledge of darkness.
Something that acknowledges the past without being imprisoned by it.
A philosophical perfume.
All perfume is philosophical, Monsieur Poirot. It is memory made tangible, emotion given form. Sylvie's expression softened slightly. Not warmth, precisely, but respect.
I actually liked her, which surprised me. I do not often like people.
Yet someone disliked her enough to commit murder most elaborate.
Yes, though I think the elaboration was the point, not an accident.
The softness vanished.
Whoever killed Imogen wanted to make a statement, not merely to end a life.
Poirot let silence extend. She did not fidget, did not look away. Most people found silence uncomfortable. Sylvie Narcisse was not most people.
You were seen in Madame Beaumont's section of the catacombs, he said at last, copying formulas, including a perfume called Algérie.
No hesitation.
Research. I'm writing a monograph on perfume composition in Grasse from 1920 to 1940.
And this research required you to examine a formula connected to Sidi Madani? Connected to the same tragedy that connects Rashid, the Carver family, and now a murdered woman?
I did not know those connections when I began my research.
But her voice had changed, a fractional tightening, audible only to someone listening for exactly that frequency of deception. Mademoiselle, I have spent the morning at the library. Permit me to share what I have learned. Poirot leaned forward. The distillery explosion at Sidi Madani killed 5 workers, including a 14-year-old girl and her father. The equipment was supplied by the Carver shipping line, despite known defects. The perfume Algérie was commissioned by the same Carver 1 year before the explosion, a gift for his wife, made from the very orange blossoms distilled in that same facility. He paused. A facility that your father helped supply with contracts. A facility in which your mother worked. The change in her was not subtle this time. Her hand jerked, knocking a glass beaker from the bench. It shattered on the stone floor with a sound like a gunshot, and in the ringing silence that followed, Sylvie Narcisse stood very still, staring at the fragments as though they held some message she could not quite decipher.
My father told you, she said at last, about my mother.
He did not, but I have eyes, mademoiselle. I see the North African heritage in your features, which your father's colouring only partially obscures. I see the way you flinch, yes, you do flinch, however slightly, when Sidi Madani is mentioned. And I have read the note Rashid showed you, the one whose handwriting you claimed not to recognize. She knelt and began collecting the broken glass, her movements precise, even in distress. Poirot waited. He had learned, over many years, that the moments when people bent to mundane tasks were often the moments when truth escaped.
My mother was Algerian, she said quietly, not looking up. She worked in the Sidi Madani distillery. She survived the explosion, but she was badly burned. She died 3 months later, in childbirth. I was that child.
And your father never told you?
He raised me as French, gave me his name, never spoke of her.
Her voice was raw.
I discovered the truth 2 years ago, in letters I found in his desk. Letters from her,
begging him to help the workers, to replace the failing equipment, to intervene before disaster struck. Her finger stopped moving among the glass.
He did nothing, and she died.
Everyone connected to Sidi Madani carries guilt, Poirot said gently.
Yes.
She stood,
a fragment of glass held carefully between thumb and forefinger, catching the light. The carvers who supplied the equipment? My father, who knew and did nothing? Beaumont, who prioritized profit? They all share responsibility. She set the glass down. I believe Imogen was trying to atone, and I believe someone decided atonement was insufficient. The note in the catacombs. You recognize the handwriting. She met his eyes, and for the first time, Poirot saw something behind the clinical mask that looked like fear. Not the handwriting specifically, the style. It is Chancery hand, a formal calligraphic style. My mother's letters were written in the same hand. Not by her, she was barely literate, but by a friend who served as her scribe, a woman who stayed with her during the final months. This friend, do you know her name? I know only what my mother called her in the letters. Zara. It means flower in Arabic. Sylvie's mouth twisted. A flower for the flower trade. There is an irony there that my mother, who had no French sense of irony, would not have appreciated. You have been searching for this woman? For 2 years. It is why I came back to Grasse, why I took on the work with my father, why I began the monograph. All of it, an excuse to dig into the archives, the connections, the history. She straightened her spectacles with the gesture of someone reassembling armor. I did not find her, but I think she found me. What do you mean? 3 weeks ago, I received a package. No return address, posted from Marseille. Inside was a small bottle of perfume, unlabeled, hand-blended, extremely sophisticated, and a card in that same chancery hand. For the daughter of Amina. The composition begins. Poirot felt the architecture of the case shift, columns realigning, load-bearing walls revealing themselves where he had seen only decoration. You did not report this? To whom? The police would have dismissed it as a prank. My father would have been destroyed by the reminder. She paused. And I wanted to know what it meant. I wanted to meet this woman who had loved my mother, who had carried her story for 25 years. I wanted to understand what she intended. And now that a woman is dead? Sylvie's face was terrible in its control. Now I understand that good intentions and vengeance can wear the same perfume. The laboratory door opened. Lucien Narcisse stood there, his face stricken. Hercule, you must come at once. Madame Beaumont, she has been attacked. Chapter 7. The Second Note. The workshop behind Madame Beaumont's house was in chaos. Glass littered the floor like scattered diamonds, catching the afternoon light in 1,000 wicked glints. A copper still lay on its side, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the flagstones. The acrid smell of chemicals mixed with something sweeter, more insidious. The cloying scent of bitter almonds that Poirot recognized immediately as symptomatic of certain volatile compounds. And in the center of this devastation sat Madame Beaumont, a glass mask still strapped to her face, her hands shaking violently as a doctor attempted to remove it. "No, no!" she was saying, her voice muffled. "Leave it! Not yet! The air!" Inspector Lebrun turned to Poirot, his face drawn. She was found 20 minutes ago by her housekeeper. The door was locked from inside, but the attacker had clearly been and gone. If she had not been wearing that mask... Poirot stepped carefully through the wreckage. The overturned still, the shattered beakers, the workbench swept clean of all but fragments. And there, on a shelf untouched by the violence, a small glass vial. He knew what it was before he reached it. "Do not touch that!" Madame Beaumont's voice, stronger now as the doctor removed the mask.
It is what he left, like the poor English girl.
The vial was identical to the first. Same size, same shape, same wax seal. Inside, layered oils formed their precise spectrum, and attached by silk thread was a card. Note 2/7. Madame Beaumont's account was delivered with the steadiness of a woman who had survived enough in her life to survive this too. The figure in the doorway, the thrown flask, the fumes. Her instinct to grab the respirator mask she kept for working with concentrated essences.
They did not check to see if I had succumbed, she said. They simply left the vial and departed.
This is not finished, is it? She looked at Poirot, and in her pale eyes was something new. Fear.
The English girl was note 1. I am note 2. There will be 5 more.
We must proceed on that assumption, Poirot agreed. He turned to Sylvie, who had followed them. The building connects to the catacombs?
Through the cellar.
My research confirmed it. The access was sealed 30 years ago, but stone can be moved. 2 officers sent to examine the cellar confirmed it within minutes. The brick wall had been carefully dismantled, the bricks stacked neatly, and on the wall beside the opening, painted in white chalk, a 7-petaled flower, a jasmine blossom, stylized and perfect. The first 2 petals filled in with red. Poirot studied the diagram with the intensity of a man reading Holy Writ. 7 victims planned, 2 struck, 5 remaining. And the Festival of Jasmine now 3 days away.
The liquid that was thrown at you, madame, you recognized it? Neroli oil, highly concentrated, mixed with something that should not be inhaled. Whoever prepared it understood chemistry. And the vial's contents?
She examined it without touching.
7 layers again.
Myrrh at the bottom, sandalwood above, jasmine, rose absolute, orange blossom, the neroli, bergamot, and at the top, violet leaf, I think.
The same historical progression, Sylvie said. Base notes to top notes, a timeline encoded in scent.
Or a countdown, Poirot said softly. Note 1 was the end of the sequence. Note 2 adds the layer above. If this pattern holds, Note 7 will complete the formula.
A perfume designed over the course of 7 murders,
Madame Beaumont said.
C'est monstrueux.
It is also a message. And messages, madame, are meant to be read. Poirot's eyes were very bright now. Each oil represents a historical period. What if those periods correspond not to perfume history in the abstract, but to the specific history of Sidi Madani, to the sequence of decisions that led to the explosion? Sylvie's eyes widened. The first layer, myrrh, the oldest style, could represent the initial exploitation of Algerian resources. The second, the establishment of the distillery. The third... We theorize, Poirot interrupted himself. We must not theorize too far ahead of the facts. But the framework is suggestive. He turned to Lebrun. Do not cancel the festival. If we disrupt the pattern, the killer adapts. Better to know where they will strike. You mean to use the festival as bait? Lebrun's expression suggested he found this idea somewhere between courageous and insane. I mean to use the festival as a stage. Our killer has designed a performance. Very well. Let them perform. But the audience will be prepared,
and the final act will not conclude as they intend. Madame Beaumont's smile was grim. Then I shall endeavour to remain alive for the curtain call, Monsieur Poirot. Outside, evening descended upon Grasse. The streets filled with jasmine scent, sweet, haunting, and now, to Poirot's sharpened senses, faintly ominous. Somewhere in this town, a killer was preparing. Note 3. And Hercule Poirot had only 3 days. Chapter 8. Into Darkness. Poirot returned to the catacombs alone. Not from recklessness. He had considered the risks with the precision he brought to all things. But from necessity. There were details in the murder chamber that could not be properly examined under the glare of police lamps and the well-intentioned interference of Inspector Lebrun. It was past midnight. The streets of Grasse slept under a thin moon, and the entrance to the tunnels gaped like a mouth awaiting prey. He carried an electric torch, Sylvie's map, and a small vial of smelling salts tucked into his waistcoat pocket. A precaution that felt simultaneously absurd and necessary. The descent was easier now that he knew what to expect, though the darkness remained oppressive. His torch beam carved a pale tunnel through the black, and his footsteps echoed off stone walls that had stood for millennia. He followed the map, turning left, then right, descending always deeper. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air grew dense with moisture and the ghost scent of stored essences. The murder chamber was exactly as he remembered. The chair still in place, though the body had been removed. The chalk drawing of the 7-petaled flower remained. The wooden racks lined with ancient bottles stood like silent witnesses. Poirot played his torch beam methodically across every surface. What had he missed? The chair itself was unremarkable. Simple wood, sturdy, no signs of struggle. Imogen had sat willingly, or had been unconscious when positioned. The oils painted on her face had been applied with care, almost tenderness. An artist's touch. He turned to the floor. Limestone dust, undisturbed except where feet had walked. He looked not for what was there, but for what was absent. No drag marks, no signs of violence. The only disturbance was the pattern of footprints, multiple sets, overlapping. But wait. His torch caught something at the chamber's edge. A mark in the dust, partially obscured, but visible if one knew where to look. Not a footprint, a smooth line, perhaps 6 inches long, as though something cylindrical had been rolled across the floor. He knelt, ignoring the complaint of his knees. The dust had been pushed aside in a very particular way. Something smooth and cylindrical. A bottle, perhaps. But why would a bottle be rolled across the floor? Unless it had fallen. Unless someone, in the act of preparing this tableau, had dropped something and it had rolled before they retrieved it. He followed the line's trajectory. It pointed toward the wooden racks on the eastern wall. He rose and examined the bottles there. Most were covered in years of dust, but 3 bottles on the lower shelf had been recently disturbed. The dust around them showed clear marks where they had been lifted and replaced. Rose Absolute, dated 1931. Tuberose, 1933. Clove Essence, 1935. The same oils painted on Imogen's face, but these bottles had not been opened. Their seals remained intact, wax unbroken. The killer had brought their own supply, prepared in advance. Premeditation, not passion. Then why examine these bottles at all? Why lift them, disturb the dust, if not to use their contents. Poirot's torchbeam swept to the labels. Each bore, in addition to the essence name and date, a small notation in pencil, barely visible, clearly added after the original labeling. Numbers. The rose, 3. The tuberose, 5. The clove, 7. Numbers that made no sense in the context of storage inventory, but numbers that might mean a great deal in the context of a code. He took out his notebook and recorded them, then continued his examination of the racks. More bottles, more dust. And then another set of recently disturbed bottles. On the opposite wall, these were different. Bergamot, neroli, jasmine, violet. Labelled with penciled numbers 1, 2, 4, 6. 7 bottles in total. 7 penciled numbers 1 through 7. Each corresponding to one of the oils in the layered vials. Someone had been here before the murder, numbering the bottles in a sequence that corresponded to the killer's composition. Either the killer had marked them as reference points for their plan, or someone else had. Someone who understood the code and had tried to leave a map for anyone clever enough to read it. Poirot straightened, his mind racing. The penciled numbers were not in the calligrapher's elegant hand. They were hurried, angular, made by a different person entirely. Someone who had been in these tunnels, had understood what was being planned, and had tried to leave a trail. Imogen herself, or the mysterious woman who had delivered the glove? He was contemplating this when he noticed the air had changed. Not scent, a quality of atmosphere, a thickness that pressed against his sinuses. Subtle, insidious. The kind of change that might escape notice until it was too late. Jasmine. Concentrated jasmine absolute, volatilizing somewhere nearby, perhaps from a bottle left open in a passage, perhaps from a cloth soaked in the essence and placed where the air currents would carry it into this chamber. His hand found the smelling salts instantly. He broke the vial, inhaled sharply, and felt the ammonia cut through the first tendrils of narcotic sweetness with painful clarity. Then he moved, not toward the passage he had entered by, but toward the eastern wall, where a draft he had noticed earlier suggested another opening. His fingers found the gap. A narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man, concealed behind the racks. Cool air flowed through it. Fresh air, untainted. He squeezed through, scraping his jacket against stone, and found himself in a parallel tunnel that sloped gently upward. Behind him, the jasmine scent thickened. Whoever had released it knew he was here. But they had not confronted him, had not attacked directly. They had simply made the chamber unlivable, forcing him out, or hoping the slow saturation would render him unconscious before he noticed. A warning, not an assassination. The distinction mattered. He climbed, his torch casting wild shadows. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, then opened into a space he recognized from Sylvie's map. The old well shaft, now dry, that serviced this quadrant of the town. Above, a circle of stars was visible through the shaft's opening. Poirot stood there for several minutes, breathing clean air, feeling his head clear. Then he took out his notebook and added a drawing. The 7 bottles, their positions in the chamber, their penciled numbers. A map within a map. A message left by someone who had walked these tunnels before him and understood what was being built in darkness. He looked up at the stars through the well shaft. Somewhere above, Grasse slept in the perfumed darkness. And somewhere, in the limestone honeycomb beneath it,
A killer was refining their composition, note by note, death by death, petal by petal. The little grey cells had new material to work with. The numbers on the bottles suggested not mere artistry, but arithmetic, a formula that could be decoded. But first, he must survive the night. He pocketed his notebook, found the ladder bolted to the well shaft's wall, and climbed toward the stars. Chapter 9. The Map and the Message. Morning found Poirot pale but determined, seated in Narcisse's private study with maps spread across every available surface. "You might have been killed," Narcisse said for the third time. "But I was not. I was warned. There is a significant difference." Poirot's fingers traced Sylvie's map, comparing it to older versions from the town archives. "And I gained something essential." He told them about the numbered bottles. Sylvie, who had arrived with her research files, listened with the focused intensity of a chemist presented with an unexpected reaction. "The numbers correspond to the oils in the vials," she said. "But the positions in the chamber. You say the odd-numbered bottles were on the eastern wall and the even on the western." "Precisely. And the arrangement was not random. When I plot their positions on the map," he took a pencil and began marking points, "they form a pattern." Inspector Lebrun, nursing coffee at the window, leaned forward. "What kind of pattern?" "Each bottle's position corresponds to a location above ground." Poirot drew lines connecting his marks to points on the surface map of Grasse. Number 1, the bergamot, sits beneath the old Fragonard factory. Number 2, the neroli, beneath the municipal jasmine fields. Number 3, the rose, beneath the monastery garden. And the others? Number 4, the jasmine, beneath the plaza before the cathedral. Number 5, the tuberose, beneath this building, Maison Narcisse itself. Number 6, the violet, beneath Madame Beaumont's house. He paused. And number 7, the clove, beneath the main pavilion at the Festival of Jasmine. Sylvie's head snapped up. "The sites form a flower pattern across the map." A 7-petaled jasmine. Each petal a location. Each location a note in the composition. Poirot set down his pencil. "But these positions were not marked by the killer. The handwriting was different, hurried, angular. Someone else mapped the plan and left it for us to find." "Imogen," Narcisse said softly. "She was working with Sylvie on encoding messages in perfume. Perhaps she discovered the killer's plan and tried to leave a record." "Or the woman who gave me the glove," Poirot countered. "Someone who knows the tunnels intimately, who has been watching the preparations, who understands the code." The room fell silent as the implications settled. "2 attacks down," Lebrun said. 5 sites remaining. Thousands of people at the festival in 2 days, even with help from Nice. "We do not need to defend all 5 sites," Poirot said, "because the attacks are not random. They follow the sequence of the perfume. Base notes first, ascending to top. The next target will correspond to note 3, the jasmine layer. And jasmine, in our map, corresponds to the plaza before the cathedral." "You are gambling on a theory," Lebrun protested. "I am gambling on the killer's obsession with pattern. Someone who constructs this elaborate a framework does not deviate from it. The composition must be perfect. Each knot in its assigned place, each element precisely measured." Poirot met his gaze. "Place your officers at the Cathedral Plaza tomorrow. That is where Note 3 will be attempted." "And if you are wrong?"
then the little grey cells will have failed, and you may take full credit for telling me so. Lebrun departed to make arrangements. Narcisse excused himself, looking decades older than his years. Poirot remained at the table, staring at the maps, and was not surprised when Sylvie did not leave. "The package you received," he said without looking up. "The perfume from Zara. What did it smell like?" "Like jasmine, but not the jasmine of Grasse. Something wilder, less refined. Jasmine the way it grows in North Africa, in the hills above the orange groves." She paused. "Like my mother, perhaps, though I have no memory of her." "You said Zara was your mother's scribe, her friend, the woman who sat with her as she died." Poirot looked up now. "And you said she has been living in the catacombs." "I said I could take you to her. That is not the same thing." Sylvie's expression was carefully controlled, but her left hand, the one she thought Poirot could not see, gripped her laboratory coat again, the knuckles white. "She has been moving through the tunnels for weeks. I have found traces, a blanket in one of the deeper chambers, food scraps, candle wax. She knows the catacombs better than anyone alive." "How is this possible? She is not from Grasse." "She came here 30 years ago, when my mother first arrived with my father. She worked in the tunnels, manual labor, moving bottles, cleaning equipment. She learned every passage, every connecting shaft, every hidden chamber." Sylvie's voice was quiet. "When my mother died, she disappeared. But she never truly left. She has been here, or returning here, for 25 years. Watching. Waiting. Waiting for what? For the right moment. For all the guilty parties to be gathered in one place." Sylvie met his eyes. "For me to be old enough to understand." "You believe she is the killer?" The silence stretched. When Sylvie finally spoke, her voice was stripped of its clinical detachment, and what remained was the voice of a young woman who had lost her mother before she could remember her face. "I believe she loved my mother. I believe she made a promise to a dying woman. And I believe she has spent 25 years preparing to keep it." She straightened. "But I also believe she did not act alone. The chemistry involved, the preparation of the vials, the precise selection of oils, this requires knowledge she does not possess." "Then who is her accomplice?" "That," Sylvie said, "is what your little grey cells must determine. I have told you everything I know. The rest is yours." She left the study, and Poirot sat alone with his maps and his thoughts, turning the fragments of evidence over and over until they began, slowly, to arrange themselves into something that resembled truth. Not yet complete, but close. Chapter 10. The Unraveling. The breakthrough came not from investigation, but from absence. Poirot had spent the afternoon reviewing Sylvie's research files, lists of names, dates of employment, connections to the colonial trade. His eyes were tired, his mind protesting, and twilight was settling over Grasse when he stopped, stared at the list in his hand, and felt the little grey cells fire with sudden, brilliant clarity. It was not what was on the list. It was what was missing. He had been looking for connections to Sidi Madani among the living. But what about the dead? Philippe Beaumont, the widow's son, had died in a laboratory accident 5 years ago. The official report cited equipment failure. An accident. But what if it was not an accident? The question opened doors that had been invisible moments before. If Philippe's death was not accidental, it was revenge. the first note in a composition that had been playing for longer than anyone realized. Not 7 days, 5 years, perhaps longer. And if that was true, then the killer had been here, in Grasse, embedded in the community, for years before Imogen Carver ever arrived. Poirot reached for the telephone. 20 minutes later, he had the information he needed. Philippe Beaumont had died in an explosion of a copper still. Old equipment, poorly maintained, the same failure that had killed 5 workers in Sidi Madani. The investigating officer had noted the similarity in his report, then dismissed it as coincidence. There are no coincidences in murder, Poirot thought. Only patterns we have not yet learned to see. A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. Narcisse entered, carrying wine. "You will make yourself ill, mon ami." "Tell me about your wife," Poirot said without preamble. Narcisse's hand stilled. "My wife? But she died 25 years ago. What could she—" "Everything. Tell me everything." And Narcisse did. The meeting in Algeria, the opposition from his family, the love that overcame objection, the letters, those terrible letters, begging him to intervene at the distillery, his silence, her journey to Sidi Madani to help her ill sister, the explosion, the burns, the 3 months of agony, and the birth of a daughter who would never know her mother. "A woman came to sit with her during the final weeks," Narcisse said, his voice hollow. "An Algerian woman from the community in Marseille. Young, perhaps 20. She sang to Amina in Arabic." "Her name?" "I do not remember. But after Amina died, she came to me. She said the silence of good men was as guilty as the cruelty of bad ones. That one day there would be accounting." "And at Imogen's reception, you noticed a woman you did not recognize." Narcisse looked up sharply. "How did you know?" "Because she has been here for months, perhaps years. She has been watching all of you. You, Beaumont's widow, and now Imogen Carver." Poirot rose. "But she is not working alone. The chemistry required for the vials, the precise selection of oils, this exceeds the knowledge of someone who moved bottles for a living 30 years ago. She has an accomplice, someone with training, someone with access." "You cannot possibly think Sylvie—" "No." Poirot's voice was firm. "Sylvie is not the accomplice. But Sylvie received a package 3 weeks ago from this woman. A bottle of perfume and a card reading, 'The composition begins.' She has been following the plan unfold without reporting it. She is not complicit, but she is compromised. Caught between her desire to understand her mother's story and her duty to prevent further harm." Narcisse sank into a chair. "Then who?" Poirot moved to the window, looking out over the steep streets. "Who in Grasse has intimate knowledge of perfume chemistry, access to the catacombs, reason to harbour resentment toward the perfume establishment, and the skill to create elaborately layered vials?" The answer, when it came, was so obvious that Poirot felt something very close to embarrassment at not seeing it sooner. "Rachid," Narcisse whispered. "No. Rachid has an alibi for the first murder and motive to protect Imogen, not kill her. He was coming to terms with grief, not cultivating it." Poirot turned from the window. "But there is someone we have overlooked entirely. Someone whose name appears nowhere in our investigation, because everyone, including me, has treated them as furniture.
Who? The young man in the leather apron. The one working in your laboratory when we first descended to the catacombs.
The one you waved back to his task without introduction, because he was beneath notice. Poirot's eyes were very bright.
Who is he, Lucien?
Narcisse frowned.
Michel. He is a laboratory assistant. He has worked for us for 3 years. He is quiet, competent, unremarkable. His full name? Michel Nassiri.
Narcisse's face drained of colour.
Nassiri.
The surname of the distillery foreman killed at Sidi Madani, and of his 14-year-old daughter. Poirot's voice was quiet but relentless. Rashid is not the only surviving relative. Hassan Nassiri had a son as well, a boy who would have been 9 years old when his father and sister died. A boy who grew up, trained in chemistry, came to Grasse under his own name that no one thought to question, and embedded himself in the household of the man most directly responsible for his family's destruction. The silence in the room had the quality of a held breath.
3 years, Narcisse said. He has been here 3 years. In my laboratory, handling my materials, walking my catacombs. Learning your methods, mastering your art, and waiting for the woman who raised him, Zara, your wife's friend, who took in the orphaned boy after the explosion and devoted her life to his care and his education. Waiting for her to say the composition was ready to begin. And Sylvie knew?
Sylvie suspected. She recognized the handwriting on the package because she had seen Michel's notes in the laboratory. The same angular, hurried script. She has been trying to confirm her suspicion without alerting anyone, because she is caught in an impossible position. The woman who orchestrated this is the last living connection to her dead mother. A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Sylvie stood there, her face unreadable.
You are correct, Monsieur Poirot, about nearly everything.
She stepped into the room.
But you are wrong about one thing. Michel is not merely an accomplice. He is the architect. Zara brought the grief, the memories, the moral authority. But Michel brought the plan. The 7 notes, the vials, the code. He has been designing this for years.
Where is he now?
In the catacombs, where he has been every night for the past week, preparing.
She paused.
And if we do not reach him before tomorrow, the festival will become a memorial to more than Jasmine.
She turned toward the door, and, after a moment's hesitation, Poirot and Narcisse followed. The endgame had begun. Chapter 11. The Festival Eve. The catacombs at night were a different world from the one Poirot had visited before. This time, he was not alone. Sylvie led the way, her torch beam steady, her knowledge of the tunnels evident in the certainty of each turn. Behind Poirot came Inspector Lebrun with 2 officers, and behind them, moving with the reluctance of a man walking toward his own judgment, Lucien Narcisse. He will be in the deep chambers, Sylvie said, her voice low. The sections that do not appear on any official map. There are rooms down here that haven't been used in a century. Natural caverns that the quarrymen discovered and abandoned. And Zara? With him, I expect. She has been his eyes and ears above ground. She moves through Grasse like a ghost, invisible because no one looks at an aging woman in servant's clothes. She was at the cafe when she gave you the glove. She was at Imogen's reception. She has been everywhere, and no one saw her. The tunnels narrowed, the ceiling dropping until even Poirot had to duck. The electric lights had ended long ago. There was only torchlight and the sound of their breathing. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said quietly, "when we find them, you must allow me to speak. The situation is delicate, yes." Her voice carried an edge he had not heard before. "I am aware that the woman who planned all this loved my mother. I am aware that the man who designed it lost his father and sister to the same tragedy. I am not without feeling, Monsieur Poirot, whatever you may think. I think you have more feeling than you allow yourself to show. That is not the same as having none." She did not respond, but her pace slowed fractionally, the physical manifestation of someone who has been seen more clearly than they intended. They descended further. The air grew colder, damper, and the scent of stored essences gave way to raw limestone and mineral water. Then Sylvie stopped. "There!" She pointed her torch at a gap in the wall. Not a doorway, but a natural fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. Beyond it, faint light flickered. Candlelight. Poirot held up a hand, stopping the officers. "Inspector, remain here with your men. If I call, come quickly. But let me approach first." "This is highly irregular." "So is everything about this case. Please, Inspector." Lebrun nodded reluctantly. Poirot turned to Sylvie. "You will come with me?" "Yes." No hesitation. They squeezed through the fissure and emerged into a cavern that took Poirot's breath away. It was perhaps 40 feet across and twice as high, a natural cathedral carved by water over millennia. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen rain. The walls were smooth and pale, and they gleamed in the light of dozens of candles arranged on ledges and outcroppings with an artist's eye for effect. And in the centre of this underground cathedral, a man and a woman sat at a wooden table, surrounded by glass bottles, copper instruments, and the accumulated materials of 25 years of grief refined into purpose. Michel Nassiri looked up at their entrance. He was young, younger than Poirot had expected, perhaps 22, and his face held none of the theatrical malice one might expect from a man who had committed murder. Instead, he looked tired, profoundly, terribly tired, like someone who had been carrying a weight beyond his strength and was almost grateful to set it down. Beside him, the woman called Zara rose to her feet. She was the woman from the cafe, dark hair going grey, that narrow, intelligent face, those eyes that held decades of sorrow. But here, in the candlelight, she looked less desperate and more resolute. The face of someone who had made peace with what they had become. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was calm, almost welcoming. "And Sylvie, I wondered if you would come together." "Zara?" Sylvie's voice caught on the name, the first time Poirot had heard her composure fail so completely. "I have been looking for you for 2 years." "I know, and I have been watching you look." The older woman's expression softened. "You have your mother's face. Did anyone ever tell you that? Not Lucien, he would not have dared. But I knew Amina's face better than my own, and I see it in you. Every line, every expression." "You killed Imogen Carver," Poirot said, stepping forward. His voice was not accusatory, but simply factual, the way a doctor might announce a diagnosis. "And you attempted to kill Madame Beaumont." "Imogen Carver is dead, yes." It was Michel who spoke, rising from his chair. His hands, Poirot noted, were stained with the residue of essential oils, the hands of someone who had spent hours in precise chemical work. But I killed her, not Zara. The plan was mine. The execution was mine. She helped me prepare, yes. She helped me understand what was owed. But the act itself... His voice was steady. I sat with her in that chamber. I told her who I was, who my father was, who my sister was. And I watched comprehension dawn in her eyes, and I watched her try to speak, and I watched the oils take her consciousness, and then her life. And then this English woman arrives with her money and her guilt, and says she is sorry, and we are supposed to accept this, to say, yes, how generous, how noble, to finally acknowledge, after 13 years, that 5 human beings were murdered by negligence. The fund she proposed would have helped your family. My family is dead, Monsieur Poirot. A fund cannot resurrect them. Poirot regarded the young man with the complex mixture of understanding and sorrow that long experience with human nature had cultivated in him. Here was not evil, but grief transmuted into something terrible. Here was not madness, but logic. A logic that had begun from a true premise and, through years of isolation and pain, arrived at a monstrous conclusion. "And the others?" Poirot asked. "The remaining notes. What was planned for the festival?" Michel and Zara exchanged a glance, the wordless communication of people who have shared purpose for so long that speech has become almost superfluous. "The festival was to be the final note," Michel said. "The completion of the composition. 7 guilty parties, 7 acts of accounting. Imogen for the carvers, who supplied the equipment. Madame Beaumont for her husband, who ignored the warnings. The 3rd note was to be for the colonial administrator's grandson, who now sits on the festival committee. The 4th for the inspector who buried the investigation. The 5th, he looked at Sylvie, for Maison Narcisse. Not you, Sylvie, never you, but the house itself, the reputation, the legacy built on silence." "And the 6th and 7th? Poirot pressed. "The 6th was for Rashid. He came to Grasse with the same intention I did. Revenge. But he allowed himself to be pacified by an Englishwoman's apology. He betrayed our father's memory." "Rashid is your brother," Poirot said. "Rashid is the man who should have avenged our family, and chose forgiveness instead. That is not brotherhood. That is cowardice." "And the 7th knot?" Michel's gaze moved to Narcisse, who stood in the fissure entrance, his face grey with horror and guilt. "The 7th note was always for you, Monsieur Narcisse. The man who married my father's colleague, who heard her pleas, who had the power to intervene, and who chose his career over 5 lives. The 7th note would have been played at the festival, before thousands of witnesses, so that all of Grasse, all of France, would finally know what their perfume industry was built upon." Narcisse made a sound that was not quite a word, an exhalation of guilt so compressed that it had become almost solid. "You would have killed him," Poirot said. "Not killed." It was Zara who answered, and her voice held something that Poirot had not expected. Doubt. The plan changed. Many times. In the beginning, yes, it was death. 7 deaths for 5. But as the years passed and Michel grew,
and I watched Sylvie from a distance. She stopped. The composition shifted. It became less about ending lives and more about ending silence, about forcing the truth into the open, where it could not be ignored. Yet Imogen Carver is dead. Yes, Zara's composure finally cracked, and beneath it was something raw. Not remorse, exactly, but the recognition of a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. She was supposed to be the statement, the first note, the loudest, the one that would make people pay attention. After that, the others would be threats, warnings, symbolic attacks. Poirot shook his head. Madame Beaumont was nearly killed. She was meant to be frightened, not harmed. The respirator. I knew she kept it within arm's reach. I had watched her work for months. Michel's voice held a tremor now, the first crack in his certainty. The gas was calculated to disorient, not to kill. If she had not had the mask, she would be dead, and you would be a murderer twice over instead of once. Poirot's tone sharpened. You speak of precision, of calculation, of a composition carefully designed. But murder is not chemistry, monsieur. It is chaos wearing a mask of order. You cannot control its consequences any more than you can control the wind. The silence that followed filled the cavern like water rising. He is right, Zara said quietly. She reached out and placed her hand over Michel's, and the gesture was so maternal, so achingly tender, that Poirot felt his throat tighten. He is right, and I think I have known it for some time, since before Imogen died, since the moment I held that glove and felt the blood on the fingertips, and knew that what we had set in motion could not be stopped by good intentions. You gave me the glove, Poirot said. You sought me out. Why? Because part of me wanted to be stopped. Her eyes glistened in the candlelight. Amina would not have wanted this. She was gentle, so gentle that even the men who killed her could not extinguish that gentleness. She died asking me to take care of her daughter, not to avenge her death. Zara's voice broke. But grief is a poison, Monsieur Poirot. It enters slowly, and by the time you recognize it, it has changed you into someone the dead would not recognize. It is not too late, Sylvie said. She stepped forward, and for the first time, her mask was entirely gone. Her face was open, vulnerable, and marked with tears she made no effort to hide. It is not too late to stop. The festival has not happened. No one else has been harmed. Imogen is gone. Nothing can change that. But the rest of the composition does not have to be completed. The law will not see it that way, Michel said. I killed a woman. There is no partial surrender for that. No, Poirot agreed. There is not. You will face justice for Imogen Carver's death, and rightly so. But there is a difference, recognized by law and by conscience, between a man who kills once in the grip of grief and a man who kills 7 times in the pursuit of perfection. He extended his hand. The vials, monsieur, the remaining materials, everything you have prepared. Michel looked at his hand for a long moment. Then he looked at Zara, who nodded once, a small, tired movement that seemed to contain the weight of 25 years of accumulated sorrow. And then he looked at Sylvie. Your mother's name was Amina, he said. She had a birthmark on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. She sang when she worked, old songs in Berber that no one else in the distillery understood. She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw, and I was 9 years old, and she gave me orange blossoms from her apron and told me they smelled like happiness.
Sylvie made a sound that was not quite a sob. I did this for her, Michel said, but she would have hated it. I know that. I have always known that. He reached beneath the table and produced a wooden case. Inside, nestled in velvet, were 5 glass vials. Notes 3 through 7, prepared and waiting, each one a small glass monument to grief and rage and the terrible patience of the bereaved. He placed them in Poirot's hands. Then he sat down, placed his own hands flat on the table, and waited for the officers to come. Chapter 12. The Jasmine Festival. The Festival of Jasmine opened 2 days later, under skies of perfect blue. Poirot watched from the terrace of the Café de la Fontaine as the town transformed. Garlands of jasmine blossoms draped every lamppost and archway. The fountain in the square had been decorated with floating flowers, and the air, already scented by centuries of perfumery, became almost overwhelmingly sweet, as though the town itself were exhaling one collective breath of beauty. The arrests had been quiet. Michel Nassiri had surrendered without resistance. Zara had wept as the officers led her away, not for herself, Poirot thought, but for the promise she had made to a dying woman and the terrible shape that promise had taken over the years. Inspector Lebrun, who had initially been inclined to claim the resolution as his own, had been persuaded by Narcisse, and by the realization that the story's complexities would require a more delicate public explanation than his skills could manage, to acknowledge Poirot's role with gracious, if somewhat grudging, admiration. "A remarkable case," Lebrun had said, shaking Poirot's hand with the vigor of a man who has narrowly escaped professional catastrophe. "The 7-note structure, the coded vials, the underground network, it will be studied in police academies for years." "It will be studied," Poirot had replied, "as a lesson in how long silence can fester before it erupts. That is its true significance." Now, seated in the spring sunshine, Poirot reflected on the tangled threads of the case as the festival swirled around him. The moral questions it raised were not the sort that could be resolved by the arrest of a murderer or the filing of a police report. Imogen Carver had come to Grasse seeking beauty and atonement. She had found death instead, administered by a young man who had lost everything to the same negligence her father had profited from. Was her death justice or tragedy? The answer, Poirot thought, was both, and that was precisely what made it unbearable. Narcisse joined him at the table, looking diminished. The past week had aged him in ways that went beyond the physical. He had been forced to confront not merely his complicity in a long-ago tragedy, but the realization that his entire life, his success, his reputation, the perfume house that bore his name, had been built, in part, on the foundation of his silence. "The fund Imogen established," Narcisse said quietly. "Her solicitors confirm it was already in effect before her death. The money will reach the families of those who died at Sidi Madani. That is something. It is not enough, but it is something." He stared at the festival crowds. "I have decided to create a memorial, here in Grasse, for the workers who died in colonial distilleries, not only Sidi Madani, but all of them. The perfume industry owes its existence to generations of laborers whose names were never recorded,
whose deaths were never mourned. It is time we acknowledged that debt. A worthy gesture. A gesture, yes. Sylvie says I am good at gestures and poor at substance. His smile was rueful. She is not wrong. How is Mademoiselle Sylvie? Changed. Narcisse chose the word carefully. Meeting Zara, hearing her speak of Amina, it gave Sylvie something she has been seeking since she found those letters. Not answers, exactly, but context. The shape of the life she was denied. And Rashid? He has asked to visit Michel in custody. I believe the inspector will allow it. They are brothers, after all, however much that bond has been strained. Narcisse paused. Rashid told me something before all of this. He said he came to Grasse intending revenge, but found that the weight of hatred was heavier than the weight of grief. That at some point he had to choose which burden to carry. He chose grief. A wise choice. And one Michel did not make, or could not make. Narcisse's eyes were wet. He was 9 years old, Hercule. 9 years old when he lost his father and his sister. Zara raised him, fed him her own grief along with her bread. By the time he was old enough to choose for himself, the choice had already been made. Poirot said nothing to this. There was nothing to say that would not diminish the truth of it. The festival continued. A brass band played in the square. Children ran between the stalls, their faces painted with jasmine blossoms. Tourists bought perfume in elegant bottles, and sellers extolled the virtues of their wares with the practiced enthusiasm of generations. The coronation ceremony for the festival queen proceeded on the central stage. A young woman from the town, radiant in white, crowned with a circlet of jasmine flowers. 7 petals. Poirot watched the ceremony and thought about the drawing in the catacombs. The 7-petaled flower with its red-filled petals. Only 2 had been completed. 5 remained blank. 5 lives that had been spared because a grief-stricken woman had placed a bloody glove in a detective's hand and said, "Before it is too late." She had wanted to be stopped. In the end, that was the truth of Zara's actions. Not the elaborate code, not the perfumed vials, not the theatrical staging. She had sought out Hercule Poirot because, in the deepest chamber of her heart, she knew that what she and Michel were doing was a betrayal of the woman they claimed to honor. Amina Narcisse, had asked her friend to care for her daughter, not to kill in her name. The jasmine scent drifted across the terrace, and Poirot breathed it in. Sweet and complex, with an undertone that only a trained nose could detect. Something darker, richer, the shadow that gave the flower its depth. Without that shadow, jasmine would be merely pleasant. With it, jasmine was profound. Like truth itself, Poirot thought. It was the darkness beneath that gave the light its meaning. Chapter 13. The 7th Note. There remained the matter of the vials. 3 days after the festival, Poirot sat in the laboratory of Maison Narcisse, surrounded by the 5 confiscated vials and the 2 recovered from the crime scenes. 7 small glass bottles, each containing a miniature perfume of 7 layered oils, each a chapter in a story of guilt and grief. Sylvie stood beside him, her spectacles reflecting the morning light, her expression that of a scientist
presented with an unprecedented specimen.
"You wish to decode them?"
she said. It was not a question.
"I wish to understand them. There is a difference."
Poirot turned one of the vials in the light. Michel told us the vials contained a message, that the proportions of each oil taken in sequence would spell something, but he refused to say what. Perhaps he does not know himself. Perhaps Zara encoded the message and Michel merely prepared the vessels. Sylvie took the vial from him, held it up to the window. The ratios are precise. I can see that even without analysis. Each layer is a specific fraction of the whole. If we assign numerical values to the proportions... She moved to her workbench, produced a magnifying glass and a set of calipers, and began measuring with the focused intensity that was her particular gift. Poirot watched in silence, content to let her work. It took the better part of an hour. When she finished, she had a column of numbers written on a sheet of paper. 49 figures in all, 7 from each vial.
"If we read these as percentages," she murmured, "they correspond to specific concentrations. But concentrations of what? In what context?"
Think of them not as chemistry, Poirot suggested, but as language. Zara was a scribe. She wrote letters for those who could not write. What if she encoded this message the same way she encoded all messages? In words. Sylvie stared at the numbers. Then her eyes widened.
"A substitution cipher. Each percentage maps to a letter of the Arabic alphabet. 28 letters, 28 possible percentage values between 1 and 100.
She reached for a reference book.
"If I assign the traditional abjad values..."
10 minutes later, she set down her pen. Her face was very pale. "What does it say?" Poirot asked. Sylvie read from her notes, translating slowly from the Arabic. "In the name of Amina Nasiri, who died in a foreign country, far from those who loved her. In the name of Fatima, who was 14. In the name of Hassan, who was a good father. In the name of all who are forgotten. Remember them. Speak their names. Let the silence end." She set down the paper. Her hands were shaking.
"Not a threat," Poirot said softly. "Not a formula for destruction. A memorial. The message she truly wished to deliver. Hidden inside the violence she could not prevent." "She encoded it in perfume," Sylvie whispered. "The most ephemeral medium imaginable. Something that exists only in the moment of perception, then vanishes."
She looked at Poirot with eyes that held 25 years of someone else's grief, now finally given form.
"She wanted them to be remembered."
That was all she ever wanted. And Michel? Michel wanted justice. Zara wanted memory. Their purposes overlapped, but they were not the same. Sylvie removed her spectacles and pressed her fingers to her eyes. The tragedy of it, Monsieur Poirot, is that if anyone had simply listened, if the deaths had been acknowledged, the families compensated, the names recorded, none of this would have happened. The 7 notes were a response to silence. Break the silence, and there is no need for the composition. Poirot rose, gathered the vials carefully, and placed them in their case. These should be preserved, not as evidence, the trial will proceed regardless, but as what they truly are, a memorial encoded in the language of perfume by a woman who spent her life speaking for those who could not speak for themselves. "I will keep them," Sylvie said, "in the catacombs where they were meant to be, in the chamber where my mother's friend made her stand." "And the formula?"
I will complete it. Not as Michel intended, not as a weapon, but as a perfume. A real one, meant to be worn, meant to be experienced. She straightened, and in her face, Poirot saw something he had not seen before. The fusion of her mother's warmth and her father's artistry. The union of two inheritances that had been kept separate for too long. I will call it Amina, and on the label I will write their names. Fatima, Hassan, all 5, so that everyone who wears it will carry them for a moment into the world. Poirot took his leave of the laboratory, of the Maison Narcisse, of the narrow streets and baroque fountains and eternal jasmine of Grasse. At the railway station, Narcisse and Sylvie came to see him off. Father and daughter, standing together on the platform, closer than he had yet seen them. The distance between them not erased, but acknowledged, which was, perhaps, the first step toward bridging it. You will visit again? Narcisse asked. When the perfume is ready, Poirot said. I should very much like to smell it. It will take time, Sylvie warned. A true perfume cannot be rushed. Neither can justice, mademoiselle. Neither can healing. Neither can any of the truly important things. He tipped his hat. But they can begin, and that is enough. The train pulled away from Grasse, and the scent of jasmine followed it for miles, carried on the spring air, persistent and sweet, layered with complexity that only the most attentive nose could fully appreciate. 7 notes, 7 petals, 7 layers of truth, separated by density and time, but combining, when finally released, into something that transcended any individual component. Hercule Poirot settled into his seat, placed his hat beside him with precision, and allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite satisfaction. For satisfaction seemed inappropriate in a case that had cost 1 life and damaged so many others. But rather, the quiet recognition that the little grey cells had served their purpose. The silence had been broken. The names had been spoken. The composition was complete. And in the perfumed catacombs beneath Grasse, where beauty and death had walked hand in hand through limestone darkness, the ghosts of Sidi Madani could rest at last, not forgotten. Never again forgotten. Thin,